They were teaching a lady who was wanting to join the church, and they got to something that was very problematic for her. And they said, well, we can't argue about it because it's in the Bible. And she said, it's not. And they said, well, it's in your Bible. Let's open it up. And she said, it's not. And they opened the Bible, and she'd torn that page out. So she read the Bible and went by the Bible except for the page that had something she didn't like in there. And so she was denying the truth, because if it's not there, then it's not true. We're going to talk about wisdom today. I think if you think about the Old Testament, what do you think about when you think about wisdom? Solomon. Solomon, what'd you say? Proverbs, which was written by Solomon. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about Solomon as we go get into the lesson. Likewise, we'll talk about some New Testament wisdom, and there are those that Jan mentioned Proverbs, and there are those that say that James is kind of the Proverbs equivalent in the New Testament. James spends time giving wisdom. He was an older elder in the church in Jerusalem and the brother of Jesus, we think, and he gave a lot of wisdom out, but he also gave a lot of information on what it looks like to be wise. In other words, not just, here's some things that you should try because I'm wise, and if you try them, they'll probably work, but, how do you become wise yourself so you can take information and analyze it and be wise? So as we talk about wisdom today, I laughingly say, who's going to teach this class, right? If you're going to talk about wisdom, who's going to teach? Because, maybe none of us are as wise as we want to be. All of us need to be wiser. But at the same time, I think that, there's wisdom of the world and there's wisdom of God, and you don't need to be the wisest guy. So much of the world this day and time thinks that if you get enough education, you'll be the wisest guy in the room. Your natural instincts, I go with my gut. My gut leads me to wisdom. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with listening to your gut a little bit, because that comes usually from some experience, hopefully. And there's nothing wrong with getting educated. But my parents were both college professors, and one of my dad's favorite sayings is that as they went up the level of education, that some people got educated beyond their ability to use that information. They got educated beyond their ability to think things out. They became almost robots of whoever was teaching them and whatever they read, and they couldn't take what they were taught, and they couldn't take what they read and actually come to their own conclusion. Well, that's dangerous, because you got a big, set of initials behind your name, and everybody thinks you're the wisest guy in the room, and you're really just mimicking what somebody told you or what somebody said. And today we get really educated on social media, right? We get lots of worldly wisdom on social media, but unfortunately I don't think that's true godly wisdom. So we're going to dive in a little bit and talk about what James taught us about what is wisdom and where wisdom comes from in a spiritual sense versus wisdom that more of us may think about it on our knee jerk. Now, when we're sitting here in this audience on Sunday morning, we're probably thinking first and foremost spiritual wisdom. But when we're sitting on Tuesday afternoon at work, or Thursday afternoon at the gym, or morning or whatever, and other places that we go during the week, reading the newspaper, watching the news on TV, are we thinking about spiritual wisdom? Or are we thinking about earthly wisdom? Because it's not supposed to be just about what we think about on Sunday morning and what we think about on Wednesday night. And as we laughingly say, if you're an A student, you even go to life group, or maybe a B+ student. And by the way, life groups start at homes tonight. I've still got some chairs, and there are others that have opportunities. So if you're here this morning, we hope to see you, at least somebody in the room will see you eating together and expounding upon what we learn. Maybe, again, sharing some wisdom, gaining some wisdom about what Neil teaches. Because, I laughingly, Neil's not in here, but every once in a while I want to raise my hand when Neil's preaching and say, but what about this, Neil? Or, I don't understand that, Neil. Well, we can do that in class, so raise your hands anytime. But you can't do that in the sermon. And, if you create questions while you're listening to Neil, we can answer, or at least try to answer those questions that evening at my house or Shaq's house or Jason's house, whoever's home you're going to. Let's see. How about, John, if you can read along up here, if you'll read, we're going to go 13 through 18.
Okay. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come from heaven, but it is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness.
Thank you. So James introduces the idea of where real wisdom comes from and how you respond when there's problems at work, how you respond when there's problems at home, how you respond wherever you are when things happen that maybe the world tells you somebody's insulting you, somebody's trying to get ahead of you, all these kinds of things. And your earthly, worldly ideas may be everything's a competition. And, if I succeed, or somebody else succeeds, that's my failure. If I succeed, I'm winning some sort of game in life, which is not what it's about. So in chapter 1, back when we started this, I think Monty started this, James said if anyone lacks wisdom, he should ask of God, and God will give it in abundance. So James, throughout his 5 chapters, is weaving this idea of wisdom, and particularly spiritual wisdom. And then in chapter 2, Jan led us to understand more about how wisdom is demonstrated and faith is demonstrated by our deeds and our works. So you can say I'm a wise person, I'm a Christian person, I'm a good person, and then you can do something that blows all that up and the whole world says he's not wise or she's not wise. So in chapter 3, he continues to weave this idea of wisdom and telling us that true spiritual wisdom is shown by what we say and what we do. And he did it backwards. In chapter 2, it's what we do, and in chapter 3, it's what we say, because we talked last week about the tongue and about how the world would be such a better place if we all cut our tongues off. But no one wants to do that, so the world would be a better place if we all used our brain before we used our tongue. And once we, settled in on how we should say it, and you've heard me say this many times, but, when you're typing something, you got a chance to kind of look at it and set it aside and read it before you hit send, hopefully. When your mouth starts, you don't have that button, it's hard to set it aside. Maybe run to the bathroom, get in front of the mirror and say it. And if it looks bad in front of the mirror, you probably shouldn't go out and say it. But if it doesn't look bad, you still have to be fighting that sort of self-righteous idea that I have a right to say this because I don't think that's the Christian way of going about things. So we're going to go into spiritual wisdom versus earthly wisdom. And last week there was the warning in the first 2 verses of this chapter 3 about the wiser people are the teachers, right? And therefore those of us who risk getting up here and opening our mouths, risk the idea of saying the wrong thing, risk the idea of teaching the wrong thing. So the warning there in Jerusalem, apparently James was sending this letter out, this book of James, to people who wanted to be teachers who may not be spiritually wise yet, who may not be mature enough yet. Or it could be people who just never have and never will develop the talent not to ready, fire, aim, as Shaq loves to say. Because, that never works well if you speak and then think about what you said. And so hopefully, if you have that habit and you haven't capitalized on it yet, it's probably better not to stand up here and get it even much worse than just doing it to your fellow neighbor. And the author of this lesson that I borrowed from says, James points out the fruits of false wisdom are bitter envy and selfish ambition and boasting, and these characteristics are typical of someone who lusts for attention. So, some people may want to get up here to share the truth, and other people may want to get up here because it looks, they can tell all their friends, watch the TV or watch the internet today, I'm teaching. Look at me. Or everybody in the audience, hey, look at me, I'm teaching. Instead of looking at it that, I'm going to be judged harsher than you are if I don't say what God wants me to say, if I don't teach what God teaches me to say. And what's even bigger and harder for me and for anyone who gets up here is it's not just about what I say right now. If I say it to all of you and then I don't go do it, you're really not going to do it. That spiritual wise guy, this guy that I think is wise spiritually, not this smarty wise guy, he's not doing it. He's not. I talk about going to life groups, but if I don't go to life group, then why should you go to life group, right? Because he's up there teaching, and he must be spiritually stronger than me. If I don't go to Missions of Hope and give out food from time to time, if I don't go to church functions and go visit people and do all the things that we are told to do, and we read these scriptures and we get it out there, what are we supposed to be doing? Those teachers are the ones that are looked at as the model for what everyone should be doing. We all should be doing it, but if we're teaching it, we really better be doing it because we are the models for that. So one example that was thrown out in the lesson was the Texas mom who was so jealous that she murdered her daughter's rival so her daughter would get the last spot for cheerleading. Anybody in here from Texas? Is that something that might happen? Okay, it did happen, didn't it? Well, anybody here from New York? Betty's not here right now, but I just read this past week that some rival cheerleader shot another cheerleader to get the last spot on the cheerleading squad. So, here we go. Selfish ambition taken to the extreme, but you don't have to murder somebody to be selfishly ambitious. There are loads and loads and loads of ways to take somebody out as far as them getting a position that you want. I had a nurse one time that was fantastic with my patients and fantastic with me and a rival to all of the staff. And somehow, some way, unfortunately, she thought anytime they succeeded, it made her look bad. And every time she succeeded, it made them look bad. And so everything was a point system, and she was trying to get the most points. Well, after a while, it became obvious that we couldn't work together as a team with her there. So I liked the lady a lot. And the patients liked the lady a lot, but sadly, we're a team of taking care of patients. And, I had to say, you need to find a place where you can be a singles player, or you need to learn that it's a team. And you need to celebrate when others succeed and not worry about whether you get the credit for what happens or doesn't happen. Because back in the day, there was this guy who recently ran for senator in Georgia that was a running back, and he was far and away the best running back in college football, far and away. And yet, every interview I ever heard him do, oh man, it was the play caller, it was my offensive line, it was this, it was that. The guy would never take credit for anything. And we all knew how good he was. We all knew that he was the reason. We watched him run over people, when they didn't block well. But he never took credit. But he didn't have to take credit because we all watched the game. And we knew how good he was. And that's the kind of thing that, coaches oftentimes, I love a coach that says we lost because of me, not the boys. But when they win, he says the boys won the game in spite of me. We all know Bear Bryant or whoever your favorite coach was said that all the time. We all knew how great a coach he was. They named stuff after him. He didn't, but he didn't take the credit when things went well, but he took all the credit. And then there's these coaches you see that say the boys didn't do their job today. I taught them. but they didn't do their job today. Well, that's not the kind of person any of us want to be, and that's not what Christians should be. The Greeks looked at wisdom as an abstract concept, speculation, philosophy. You remember Paul on Mars Hill talking to all the philosophers, so they took everything as relative. However, the Jewish people tended to be more practical about their wisdom, so they said the actions that you do are based on the discernment of God's will. Now, that's not to say the Jewish people did that. I'm just saying that that's what their teaching was about, where the worldly Greeks had a different kind of teaching about what wisdom looked like than what the Jewish people taught about. Well, then there's this idea of demonic wisdom. And at first, it seems contradictory to say there's such thing as wisdom that's demon-inspired, but Satan does have a certain kind of intelligence. It's not spiritual wisdom, but it's worldly wisdom as we would look at it. It's worldly intelligence as we looked at it. He is able to discern many things. The Bible tells us it's clear that he's referred to as crafty in Genesis. He tells us that the whole world is under Satan's control. 1 John 5:19 says, John says, we know that we are children of God and that the whole world is under the control of the evil one. Well, you don't get under control of the evil one if you're not wise. And so, there's a lot of very wise, worldly wise people out there. Lee's bringing that to you, John. A lot of worldly wise people out there who are wise by worldly standards, but not by spiritual standards.
Yeah, don't ever think of Satan as being unwise or stupid, because virtually every company, every corporation in this country, probably and throughout the world, uses his marketing plan. Satan has his folks on a maintenance program while he goes after God's people. And that's
Amen.
what corporations do. That's what sales teams do. They have their regular customers on a maintenance program while they go after new customers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And there is so much worldly wisdom, like you say, in business, and some of you know I'm involved in medical malpractice insurance, and the best medical malpractice insurance plaintiff lawyers, the ones like the Morgan & Morgan side of things, are incredibly wise when it comes to worldly standards. They know how to manipulate juries. They know how to manipulate people. There's something called the reptile theory, where they'll ask you a series of questions, and by the time they've got you, well, don't you think somebody deserves this, and don't you think this, and don't you think this? Well, then A, B, C, you just said this, this, and this, and that fits exactly what just happened, so now you just convicted yourself. And so their worldly wisdom, demonic wisdom, wisdom from Satan is a form of wisdom, but it's not God's wisdom. It's not spiritual wisdom. It's not the way we are called and expected to act. And if we're not careful, again, whether it's in the school or whether it's in the education we get once we get into business and climb that business ladder, if you're not careful, you get wiser and wiser and wiser like the world, and you get more manipulative and more manipulative, and you figure out how to make people do what you want to do without them knowing it, if you're really good at it. And that's what businesses do all the time. All the time. Rarely do people come to you when there's something they want and tell you exactly what they want, because it would be self-serving and, it would look bad on them. But if you can blame it on something else. Paul used this so well, and I'm not saying it was demonic at the time, but when Paul was in front of the Sanhedrin and they were about to kill him, he thought to himself, they're all against me. Wait a minute, half of them are Pharisees and half of them are Sadducees, and they just love to argue with each other and get into it, and I'm a Pharisee. I was one of them. Hey, let's talk about life after death. They brought me here because of life after death. Jesus, I said, died and raised up. I'm just saying there is an afterlife. And pretty soon they were arguing with each other, and they weren't even caring about Paul anymore, and they forgot they wanted to kill Paul at the time. Just because he got them arguing with each other. Well, Satan does that in church. Satan does that in spiritual realms. He whispers in our ear, and I was talking to Stacy Myers a moment ago about, the idea that there was a group of people in the churches of Christ out of Houston, you may or may not be aware of them, that their primary goal is teaching to go fix all the other churches of Christ in the world by being hypercritical of them and telling them they're all going, down there. And, that's got to be Satan when, you spend all your time attacking your brothers. It's, we're supposed to go out to the world and show the world our, let's see, they'll know us by the love we show one for another, right? Isn't that what John said? Inspired word. So let's all get in a circle, load our guns, and shoot. They'll know us by the love we show for one another. We're shooting each other. It's Fight Club on the Church of Christ stand. That's not to say we don't stand up for spiritual truths. We've got to. But it also says that Satan is wise in telling us how, whispering in our ear, hey, guess what somebody just did or said or didn't do or didn't say? You need to worry about this. You need to worry about that. And it gets us distracted from doing what we actually are told to do. All right, let's see. Likewise, let's go to, if left unchecked, the characteristics of earthly wisdom applied to a person who's a leader can cause church divide. So, any of you can cause a division, but if a leader starts taking sides and trying to cause trouble, it's much worse. If someone is jealous, envious, ambitious, that they apply their leadership in a way that promotes something other than Christ, they're wrong. These actions tend to multiply the sins involved until you have every evil practice. And in Jude, we were warned. Lee, you got the microphone? You want to just read that? Can you read that, Jude?
But dear friends, remember that what the apostles of our Lord Jesus Christ were told. They said to you, in these last times there will be scoffers who will follow their own ungodly desires. These are the men who divide you, who follow mere natural instincts and do not have the Spirit.
I asked last week, and a few people raised their hands, and I just remind everybody that, have you ever been involved in a church split? There are times when church splits occur for good scriptural reasons, and there's a honest division. And, maybe in some ways, as much as God doesn't like us dividing, that, there was a time when Paul went one way and Barnabas went a different way because they had a disagreement over Mark. But we understand that was an amicable split and that Mark actually became useful to Paul later. So that was not a split like if I see you. There was a place I was one time where there was a split, and if you saw people from the other congregation, they would turn in the grocery store and go the other way. They wouldn't even look at you. Well, that's not the kind of amicable split we're talking about. But if you've been involved with church splits, too often those splits occur over the color of the carpet. We chose the wrong color of the carpet. Or some other silly idea that really is not a scriptural thing at all and really should never have led to division. And I'll tell you, it's like you've heard the old adage that they got a divorce because she burned the bacon. Well, it wasn't the bacon that burned. It was much more than that. And in a similar fashion, maybe that carpet was just the last straw because there were big egos involved, there were big ambitions involved that led to the problem. So what is the list that James uses for false wisdom? Harboring bitter envy. Are we envious of anybody in the room or anywhere for that matter? Selfish ambition. The person I mentioned earlier who was ambitious because they wanted to make themselves look better at work. Boasting. I have a relative that just loves to tell everybody, I've been to Europe, I've been to China, I've been to Japan, I've been to all 50 states, I've blah, 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 blah. And I just cringe when they do that. They even love to say, they'll be sitting in a room full of strangers and they'll ask the person with them, so how many surgeries did you do today? Or something like that, so that everybody in the room, hey, that guy that I'm with is a doctor, or that guy I'm with is a lawyer, or whatever. They just love to boast. And you know what? That's not, as I said about Herschel Walker and people like that, that's not what we're about here. We're not taught, we're not told to boast. If you want to boast, boast about Christ. But do it in a loving way. Don't do it in a harsh way. I guess harboring bitter envy and envy are the same thing. Maybe it's two different kinds of envy or something. But disorder, we talked about. That's division. Every evil practice. We could spend the rest of the afternoon here talking probably, and you could all make a list, and we could get a list about, what's every evil practice. There's that kind of puts it all in a bag. Denying the truth. There was a friend of mine that was a missionary in Australia for many years, and they were teaching a lady who was wanting to join the church, and they got to something that was very problematic for her, and they said, well, we can't argue about it because it's in the Bible, and she said it's not. And they said, well, it's in your Bible, let's open it up, and she said it's not. And they opened the Bible, and she'd torn that page out. So she read the Bible and went by the Bible except for the page that had something she didn't like in there. And so she was denying the truth, because if it's not there, then it's not true. Described as earthly, unspiritual, and of the devil. So, worldly wisdom, false wisdom is of the devil. That's the ultimate author of all worldly wisdom, though sometimes it's not necessarily evident. Now, on the other hand, he lists a list of things that are godly wisdom, that are spiritual wisdom. The first one he mentions is purity, being pure, and that's an ideal for all of us. Peace-loving, something we should always be trying to do. Some people have the tendency to stir the pot and love it, throw a little match on some gas there and make it flash, so see if everybody jumps and if everybody gets into it. And I have a friend that golfs, and he golfs with the same guys for 20 years, and he tells me that if the two guys that he's playing with, one's very conservative and one's very liberal, if they get to hitting too well, he just brings up politics. And all of a sudden the balls are flying left and right and everywhere, and he just laughs. Well, in his situation, that's funny, but that's not the way we should be taking serious things in life. We shouldn't be pitting people one against the other. Now, if you're Paul and you're about to be stoned to death or beat to death, maybe you can throw that out there. But short of saving your life, you probably shouldn't be trying to create problems. Life presents us with enough problems without creating them. Considerate. My oldest daughter grew up in Naples, and she went back to school in Alabama, and she called after being there a week or two and said, everybody opens the door. Everybody says hi when you walk by. They make eye contact. How you doing today? All that kind of stuff. And she goes, where's that coming from? This is awesome. I want to stay up here. For 13 years, she stayed up there. She married an Alabama boy, and fortunately for us, she wanted to be near mom when she got pregnant with a little one. So she brought that Alabama boy back to Florida with us, and we have them next door. But, I hear that time and again. Those people are so nice. I have a lady that I work with out of Chicago with one of the big insurance companies, and her daughter went to Alabama for 4 years, and she would tell me, I just love being down there. The people are so nice. And I'm like, people should be nice everywhere. Why aren't we all considerate? Now, Southerners have their own problems. If you're not from the South, I'm not saying Southerners are nicer deep down than anybody else. There are really nice people everywhere. But I do know that culture dictates that you don't look at everybody and speak to them in some places, because then now they want to know what you're after, what you want. I don't know if I'm going to run late here, but when I first moved to Naples, there was a guy that was selling medication, drugs, stuff like that, not street drugs, but prescription stuff, and he was the number one South Florida person that was doing that, and the other guy that he talked to was number one in the Deep South, and they were tired of where they were, so they swapped places, and their sales went plummeting. And he was telling me the story, and he said, I came from the South, and first thing I had to do when I got there was ask them about their wife and their kids, and talk for the first 5 to 10 minutes about their family before I started selling something. He said, I went into the first guy in Fort Lauderdale and said, so how's your wife doing? And he goes, how do you know my wife? Well, are your kids doing okay? Don't talk about my family. Tell me what you want, and then get out of here. On the other hand, the guy from South Florida went up there, and he'd go in and say, let me tell you what I'm selling. And these people were like, he doesn't care about me. He doesn't care about my family. He just cares about selling me something. So, sometimes it's just a cultural thing, but we can all be considerate wherever we live, but we may have to learn when you're in Rome, as they say, do like the Romans do. You may have to assimilate a little bit into the culture to figure out how to be considerate by their standards, Yes, ma'am, yes, sir. The Deep South, most of us got beaten if we didn't do that. Up north, apparently it became a sarcastic thing, and you were being sarcastic, and they thought you were trying to be a smarty pants. So some of that considerate thing, you got to figure out where you are. Next on the list is really difficult for most of us. Americans are pretty much anti being submissive to anything, right? When I get to be 18, I'm submissive to nobody for no reason. Now, if I want some money, I may have to be a little bit submissive to my boss. And if I want to get a higher education, I may have to be a little bit submissive. But at the end of the day, we don't like being submissive to anybody. But we're taught to be submissive, believe it or not. Servants and submissive is what Jesus was, what the New Testament Christians told us we have to be, and that's something we need to know, that's true spiritual wisdom, because it's hard sometimes to get there. Full of mercy and good fruit, doing things that don't just entertain myself and my family, but actually doing things that help others. Being impartial. Talked a lot in a previous chapter about the idea of not going up and talking to the guy with the nice car and the nice suit on versus not talking to the person that walked in that has fill in the blank historically, not the best clothes, may have some ink on their skin, may have something going on. We should be just as loving to that person as we are the other person. And, James even reminds, I don't remember now if it's the before or after this, but James reminds them that, these are the guys that throw you in jail if you do anything. Why are you being nice to them? That's not where we're supposed to be. And sincere. We don't need to just talk it. We have to walk it. Good life, live a good life. That's in contradistinction to all evil we talked about before. And deeds done in humility. I think there was a Jewish idea that, when you were helping somebody, you're supposed to take it up to the door, knock on the door, and take off. So when they got there, wow, somebody brought me food, but I don't even know who it was. And then you get your reward up there. But if you say, I'm going to give money, but I want a post, that post has our name on it. There's a school down in Naples where my kids went, and every post had some family's name on it because they had given fill in the blank number of dollars to build the school, and they got a big plaque and recognition. Well, that's not what we're supposed to be doing as Christians. We're supposed to know that we'll get the recognition we need. We don't need the building. A lot of these big schools, these Dukes and other schools, they have buildings named after families. And one time, 20 years ago, when I was at another place as a young elder, that this lady came and said, I want to give a big donation, but I want something named after my husband. That's not deeds done in humility, by the way. That's deeds done, I'm glad that she wanted to give something to the church, but she was getting something for it that didn't necessarily need to be done, because we would have figured out who did it anyway, or others would have figured out, and she would have gotten her big reward up there. Now, this list looks a lot like Paul's fruits of the Spirit. So believe it or not, James and Paul were on the same page, and obviously they were inspired. Of course, they were on the same page, but James is just teaching some of this stuff in a little bit similar way. Now, he mentioned Proverbs when we started this thing, and I was looking for the individual who wrote Proverbs. So, the first person that most of us think about, because we learned when I was this tall in church that who's the wisest man that ever lived. Now, he too had so much prosperity that he may not have ultimately become the wisest man that ever lived. But when in his younger days, what did he ask God for? Up there, discerning heart, right? When he became king and God gave him a choice of whatever he wanted, and he said, I want a discerning heart. So God says, okay, I'll give you a discerning heart, and with a discerning heart, you'll be wise. So if you have a discerning heart, you think about things before you say it, and then you do things that reflect who you say you are, then you're one with a discerning heart, and you're a wise person. And ultimately, most people will respect you tremendously. And, maybe every once in a while they'll get mad at you, but ultimately when their emotions settle down, they'll still respect you and love you if they know the kind of person you are, because there's nothing for them to say, I knew that person didn't like me in the first place. I knew that person was after my job, my this, my that. And, the first thing that the Bible shows us about Solomon's wisdom was when the two ladies came with the baby and both claimed the baby. And we all know the story, I'm sure. One of them said, cut it in half. Or actually the judge, Solomon, said, cut it in half. And one of them said, yeah, cut it in half and give us half. But the other one said, no, give it to her. You can't kill my baby. Well, guess who got the baby? The real mother who said, I'd rather my baby be with somebody else than my baby be dead, versus the one that's obviously selfishly ambitious and says, I want that half of that baby before I'll give it back to her. And then probably the best example of wisdom in the Bible is Jesus, right? In all cases, he demonstrated the right attitude, and the time that was talked about in this lesson is when the story we all know, when they come to him and say this lady was found with somebody other than her husband, and doesn't the Jewish law say we stone her to death? Well, that was the Jewish law. We stone her. But Jesus found a way to be loving and fair and sincere while still talking about the truth. So he said, yeah, she deserves to be stoned. That's what the law says. So everybody that hasn't sinned, pick up stone and stone her. Oops. Now we're looking for some pure, perfect person who can carry out that execution. They all left. And she got an opportunity for mercy and redemption instead of an opportunity. Now, something that in that story that most people stop right there and they use that as mercy, 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 and forgiveness, 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 and we're all sinners and God just keeps forgiving us. And to a point, that is absolutely true. I'm not denying that. But the next words out of Jesus' mouth to that woman were, go and sin no more. So I think we all should be super careful to say, I'm just that way and that's just what I do, and God's going to continually forgive me because I took on God in baptism. I can just keep doing what I do. There was a church, a preacher friend of mine one time that had a term called besetting sin. And he said we all have a besetting sin or two, and those are sins we can't do anything about. They're just the way we are. And therefore, God forgives that. Well, I didn't agree with that guy's idea that we all have a besetting sin and we don't have to worry too much about fixing it because God understands. I think God expects us, when we die to ourselves and are raised up to Him, that we're supposed to be working hard to figure out how to not have any of these besetting sins, or any sins for that matter. And that doesn't mean we won't have sins. We will. But they better be ones that we don't forgive ourselves for. That we want God to forgive us for them because our heart is in the right place. When David was told, by Nathan what he had done, he didn't say, well, my besetting sin is I love beautiful women, and if I see another one I'm going to kill her husband too and take another one on. He said, no, I did wrong, and I never should have done that, and I'll never do that again. So, we all have to understand that it's not, as Paul says, a license to keep on sinning so grace abounds, right? So the first thing he says is we need to be pure. In his list of things we need to do, it's to be pure. And we think of purity, we think of children sometimes. Now, when the children get a certain age, they start acting more like us as they move up the level. They watch the adults and they say, that maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. But really young children typically play together really well. They offer each other things, they help each other, they feel sorry when one of them hurts, that sort of thing. They don't make fun and all of that. It's usually later in that single digits and into the middle school when they've watched us enough and learned from the bad habits of us to be envious and ambitious and all the things that we lead them to do. So children are a pretty good idea. A young child most of the time is a pretty good idea of how we should be. We have to be protective of ourselves, but we don't protect ourselves by having bad thoughts or actions towards others. So how do we get there? Who wants to read Philippians 4:8 for me? Shaq.
Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever ye have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you.
I think I've shared this with you before. You know, I appreciate everyone's prayers as I continue on my journey, and some of you may relate to this. Most of my mentors in life taught me to be a fabulous critic. They taught me to find what's wrong with everybody else and myself and everything, because they taught me the only way to get better is to fix, things, and you need to find what's wrong with everybody else because that makes you better somehow. Whether it was a coach, whether it was, surgical mentors, they were always finding what was wrong. And, one of the things that has been a blessing in my life beyond blessings is this Barnabas guy of mine that happens to be one of my fellow elders that came along. And when we first joined the eldership, he gave us a book that said, find your strengths and don't work so much on your weaknesses, just work on your strengths. And the idea was, in a lot of ways, accentuate what you do well and what everybody else does well. Don't spend so much time finding fault in what everybody else does. And A, you'll be happier. And B, everybody will be happier. And we'll all do well. So, being a Barnabas, being an encourager is what all of us should learn to do instead of being an analytical one. Jan, he's bringing you the microphone.
Back when I was doing leadership development in the corporate world, stumbled on some great wisdom along this line. And instead of being that extra critical person, good leaders, good bosses catch their people doing something right.
Instead of finding everything they do wrong.
Right.
And then praising them.
In public. Praise in public, criticize in private.
Amen. I, at one point in time, had some additional education over and above. I went back to school because I had missed the master's part of things. I kind of jumped from bachelor's to doctorate and missed the master's part, and my kids started getting masters, and I was jealous. No, not really. So I went back and got this master's in public health in something called lifestyle medicine, and I spent some time at the Institute of Lifestyle Medicine at Harvard, and I got to be a good friend with a lady physician up there, and she told us one time in a talk when she came to Naples and talked to some of my patients or my people that were learning good lifestyle habits. She said, my middle school boys tend to want to be hypercritical like everybody else. So every time one of them says something bad about the other one, I make them find two good things to say about the other one. She said that's done two things. It's made them more positive, and they don't talk so much because they're afraid if they say something bad, then I'll make them say two good things. And when they're mad at them, it's really hard for them to get out of their mouth the good things about their brother when they're mad at their brother. So, it was an interesting concept, and I think we could all learn from that. If I think something bad about Shaq, I should think of two good things about Shaq, and pretty soon I may think, you know what, he's got more than two things. Maybe I should not worry about that one thing so much. If it's really bad, we should talk to him about it, but we shouldn't get upset about it, angry about it, resentful about it, all the things that don't lead to healthy, happy, good relationships. The King James uses the word meek, where we, in the NIV, talked about humility. And, obviously Jesus was very humble. In each case, meek or humble sense is conveyed. The person is, with truism, demonstrates characteristics associated with Jesus. Jesus referred to himself as meek and humble in Matthew 11:29 and promised a special blessing to the meek in his Sermon on the Mount. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle, humble of heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. When we find fellow Christians that are having a difficult time with a sin or with other things, and they come to us, instead of telling them how wrong they are, not that we don't tell them that they shouldn't be doing that, but we say, come to me, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Let me help you through this. Let me help you work through this. We don't tell them it's okay, but we also don't tell them how wrong they are and how ashamed they should be. We tell them, you're right, what you did was not right, what you're doing is not right, and we need to fix it, but let me help you. Let me work through it with you. That's heavenly wisdom, and when we can discern right or wrong like Solomon, when we can be humble and show mercy like Christ did. I think we're done, but how do we get there? How can we achieve or even aspire to be the type of character that described by James that's full of purity, mercy, humility, and peace? James gives us a partial answer when he says you will reap what you sow. And in Galatians, Paul likewise says, do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. The one who sows to please his sinful nature from nature will reap destruction. The one who sows to please the Spirit from Spirit will reap eternal life. Let us not become weary or doing good, for at a proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who belong to the family of believers. So investing time in being pure will produce greater purity, and being humble, greater humility. The Holy Spirit that lives in you will produce this fruit if we only allow Him to encourage that and listen to the Holy Spirit which lives in us instead of listening to the devil who's sitting on this shoulder. That old idea, if you're old enough to remember, what, Flip Wilson or something, that said, the devil made me do it. You know, we have that little good and bad person sitting on here. Well, we have the Spirit in here, and if we'll listen to the Spirit, everything else will work out.